All right, office hours are gonna tomorrow, are gonna be 10 to 12 and 1 to 3. So rather than 9 to 12, I'll be 10 to 12 and 1 to 12. Second is the review session is gonna be at 9 o'clock, all right? So on Monday, and it'll be either at 9 o'clock at night, and so it'll be either in lane 124 or 125. So I've got the law and economics review session will be at 8 o'clock and lasts till about 9, and then there's less time. Yeah.
You said Monday?
Monday.
Okay.
Yeah, Monday night. Okay, and then exams a week from, what is today? Today's Monday.
25th.
Huh?
25th to 25th.
Monday the 25th, yeah. So I'm just saying Monday the 2nd, or it's the 1st, it's the 1st, right? April 1st is Monday, yeah, so, all right? So the exam's on the 3rd, Monday, a week from today is the review session. Okay. Classic album of the week is Woodstock, all right? This is a fairly unique in that it's a triple album. Woodstock required that many sides. This was, anybody know when Woodstock was? What year? 69, yeah. There you go. 50th anniversary of Woodstock. And of course, Richie Havens and Country Joe and the Fish and Crosby, Stills and Nash and the famous sort of Jimi Hendrix Star Spangled Banner all came from that. And when you open it up, it has this is what the scene looked like at Woodstock. So you might go ahead and take a listen to at least some of the songs on the album. Arlo Guthrie's on there, and Santana, and all sorts of good things on there. All right. So last time we were talking about what the characteristics of the law should be if it's going to minimize the total amount of coercion, right? That's the purpose of the law, is to minimize the total amount of coercion. And we said that the law, if it were to do that, would have to be general. That is, we can't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. Once it's there, it's got to apply equally to everybody. It ought to be avoidable in the sense that you ought to be able to comply with it. It ought to be known, and it ought to be predictable. And if the law has those features to it, then it's more difficult for the government to go out and coerce you. Because what we're going to do is we're going to give a monopoly of coercion over to our government, right? We're trying to maximize the amount of free action that you have. With no government, what's going to happen is government's going to be coercive. Individuals will be coercive, right? The strong will prey upon the weak if you do that. So that we have to have a government to protect our property rights. How do we make it so that that government doesn't become a coercive force and cause us more problems than we should have? So we said that, okay, if the laws have these characteristics to them, then it's less likely that the government's going to be able to go out there and to become Leviathan and coerce us themselves. And then we close with a quote from Hamilton from Federalist 62, where he says, "It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice. If the laws be so voluminous they cannot be read, or so incoherent they cannot be understood, or if they were to be repealed or revised before they were promulgated, or undergo such incessant change that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it would be like tomorrow." Okay? So that's very consistent with what Hayek is saying is what the laws ought to look like, and if we're going to protect ourselves from excessive coercion by the government, then this is the way the laws ought to have. Then he talks about the difference between what's legal and legitimate, and again, this when we first saw this with Bastiat. Bestjot said the exact same thing, right? Bestjot said that just because something is legal, it doesn't make it legitimate. That if the government is going to be limited so it doesn't engage in legalized plunder, right? If that's the case, then there's going to be things that happen that you might not consider legitimate. Mises said something very similar, where he said that a free person just has to understand that there's going to be people doing stuff you don't really want it to do. Hayek is saying the exact same thing. In fact, and what he says is that conduct within the private sphere is not the proper object for coercion, right? So that within the private sphere, it's not the proper object for government to go out and to coerce you. Now, so we've got the same thing going on with Bestjot and Mises, is that there's going to be a difference between those two things. Now, again, it doesn't mean that you can't go out and persuade other people not to do the stuff you don't want them to do, right? If you think that alcoholism is a bad thing, and you think that people ought to not drink alcohol, then you can form the Ladies' Temperance Society, and you can go out and have advertising and do whatever you want, right? We've seen that there's advertising against smoking cigarettes has reduced the amount of cigarette smoking that goes on. So as long as the government doesn't go out and enter into that private sphere of action, then you're free to go out and just tell people that, hey, we don't think you should do that. You just can't use the coercive force of government to preclude them from doing that. Because again, once you've done that, then there's not a limit, there's no bright line that says, okay, yeah, you can coerce people about this thing, but not the others. So he says that, again, there's going to be behavior that is legal, but we might not think of being as being legitimate. Chapter 10 then is just sort of a further discussion of what he's done in chapter 9. And in chapter 10, what he's talking about is that the laws form a boundary that will maximize free action. His idea is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to maximize the total amount of free action that people have. Close the door. Not yelling here. So we're trying to maximize the amount of free action that's out there. And again, we drew this before, but we think of that we have my free action and your free action. And he says that the laws, what are they to do? The laws form this boundary. Where we're trying to make that boundary as large as possible. And he says that they're general rules, right? That you can sort of think of it as a topography. That is, we have the mountains and we have the rivers and etc. And you guys are free to run around however you want, but you got to worry about, there's a river there, right? Or there's a mountain there. We don't put the mountain there to preclude you from going somewhere, right? The law is not, as we said, you can't know beforehand to whom the law is going to apply. That mountain is sitting there, and it's the same for everybody, okay? So the laws form these general boundaries that limit what you can do, and so when your actions interfere with my actions, then you got a reason for the law to be there. That is, if you're going to drive around with leaded gasoline in your car, okay? Leaded gasoline will improve your gas mileage, and so if when you make a decision about whether to drive around with leaded gas, you're concerned about, is that going to improve my gas mileage? So your action is going to be this thing in here, and what I want to do is I want to be able to have clean air. I don't want lead being spewed out into the atmosphere and causing me brain damage, okay? So we can't both have that, where your actions, your free action is interfering with my free action. And so the law's has to set some limit here, right? The law's got to make a decision about what happens when your actions are interfering with my actions. And of course, the law was changed. It used to be, if this were 1968, you could drive around and spew lead out into the atmosphere, and all the cars ran on leaded gas. But then the law was changed. So that boundary changed and said, no, you can't do that, right? You can't buy gasoline that has lead in it. And so what the purpose of the law is there is to maximize that free action. Now, in Econ 415 and in Econ 402, Public Finance and Public Choice, we talk about what we call externalities. That is, and an externality is where your action imposes a cost on me or gives a benefit to me, and it's not picked up in the price system. So what's going to happen, since it's not picked up in the price system, your action, you don't include all the marginal costs that are there. Remember we said that you do things as long as the marginal cost to you is bigger than the marginal benefit. But if you're General Electric, or let's say Detroit Edison, let's say you're Detroit Edison and you're producing electric power. And by producing electric power, you put sulfur dioxide out into the atmosphere. And the sulfur dioxide floats along and it drops into lakes, and when it drops into lakes, it creates sulfuric acid, H2SO4, and it creates acid rain, and it kills the fish and everything else. Well, you don't have to pay those costs if you're Detroit Edison, right? So what's going to happen? You're only going to include the cost to you of making electricity. You're not going to figure, oh yeah, if I put scrubbers on there, I don't get so much sulfur dioxide going out in the atmosphere. You're not going to do that because there's a cost you put the scrubbers on there. But what you're doing is you're causing a cost on me which isn't being picked up in the price system. You don't have to pay me for the fact that you've killed all the fish in my lake. So the role of government might be to have a regulation that says you can't put H2SO4 into the or you can't put SO2, sulfuric dioxide, into the atmosphere. Okay, or if you do, we're going to make you pay a tax to pay for the people that you're causing the damage to, or whatever, so that you now put that into your cost function. So what's going on there is that when you're Detroit Edison, right, your actions are this area, and it's interfering with my ability to catch fish in my lake, and so the law's got to form what that boundary is. Again, these are not specific commands, that these are general rules, but the laws are not specific commands. And that's important because if there were a central planner needs specific commands. If I were the central planner, I would say, okay, we need to produce so many gallons of gasoline, or we're going to produce this housing development, and you guys are going to live in it, right? And some of you we're going to build the housing development, and we're going to build so many units. So that if you have a central planner, you need to have laws which are specific commands to people. What Hayek says is that you don't want that. You don't want laws to be specific commands. You want laws to be general rules, right? These are general rules about how people are going to behave, right? And so that they ought to be general abstract rules that are not commands because I don't want a centrally planned state. He says that the social order requires no more than the spontaneous order of the market. Requires no more than the spontaneous order of the market. Okay? We don't need a central planner to tell us, here's what we're going to produce. Because what do we have today? We have, what is, the market is orderly, right? We know that, right? Because 9 million people woke up in New York City today. We know what happened, right? There's exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee and exactly the right amount of peanuts and exactly the right amount of bagels, and there was nobody in charge of it, okay? So it is a spontaneous order, and Hayek says you don't need more than that, right? You don't need you can imagine what Hayek would think of the Green New Deal, right? He would say, hey, this is not looking at the spontaneous order of the market. This is having a central planner say, this is what we ought to do, this is what we ought to do, this is what we ought to do, okay? So you don't need more than this spontaneous order of the market to have a society. So that basically concludes what he's talking about in chapter 10. Now chapter 11 is something that you should read and be able to answer a multiple choice of true-false question to. Because what it is, it's a history of how freedom developed in the West, okay? Talking about Cicero, etc. But it's not something that we need to lecture on. And so, again, we're not going to ask you to do an essay question from chapter 11, but you should be able to answer, you should be able to recognize the right answer, right? That's what multiple choice and true-false questions are about, is recognizing the right answer. So you should be able to handle that. Chapter 12 is the key chapter of the book, right? Chapter 12 is about, it's about the Constitution. And what he starts out with is, why did we get the Constitution in the first place? And he says, what happened was in 1767, you had the British Parliament. The British Parliament passed a resolution saying it could pass any law it had a majority for. Any law it had a majority for. And notice what in the chapter on democracy, what he said was that the temporary majority's got to be bound by these general principles by which we're going to govern ourselves. And the British Parliament isn't saying that, right? The British Parliament is saying we can enact any law that we've got a majority for. So that temporary majority can determine what's going to happen, and it's not limited. So what he argues is that in the colonies, there was a reaction to that, right? That is, the colonies, there was a reaction that said, hey, there's no arbitrary power. This is this can't be the way that we're operating. That is, what the Parliament has just said is that it has the arbitrary power to do whatever it wants as long as it's got a majority to do. Sam Adams, James Otis, and Patrick Henry all basically reacted to this and said, hey, this isn't the way that we ought to be doing it. And so that they noted that there wasn't any written down constitution in the British, the British government that said, hey, no, you can't do this. So what they decided they needed a foundation document. You needed to have some sort of, which is going to go from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. We'll talk a minute about why the Articles of Confederation didn't work out. But the idea was they still had this idea that you have this foundation document. Focusing on this issue of no arbitrary power. That is a mainstay of the United States. The government of the United States, a mainstay of that is that your federal government doesn't have arbitrary powers. You have a written document, that is the Constitution. You have a written document that is that thing that he was talking about in Chapter 8, that is, sets out those general principles that limit what the temporary majority can have. So he says that that there was always this concept, not always, but there was for a long time a concept of a higher order of law is ancient. In the West, there's this concept of a higher order of law, and we can think back to discussions about divine law, right? We for a long time had this idea that there's you couldn't do something that was in violation of divine law. Again, when we read How the West Grew Rich, we'll talk more about it. But the idea was that the West couldn't, if you were in the West, you couldn't do something if you were the king that was in violation of what divine law was. There was also a concept, by the time we get to the 17th century, we have a concept of natural law. That there's a natural law out there, and the government couldn't do things which were a violation of the natural laws. And read John Locke is one of the people that talked about that again. So there was concept out there of a higher order of law, but it's not written down. You can't say, oh gee, Parliament, you've done this and it's in violation of divine law, Article 4, Section 3, right? It's not there. So the founders are saying, you know what, we got to be able to write this stuff down. We need to have a document that says, here's what the limits are. We've already had this idea that you could limit what your government could do. We already had this idea that the government can't do any old darn thing because it couldn't do something in violation of divine law or maybe natural law. But no one, what Hayek is arguing, that no one had ever written this down before. So the idea then is that the Constitution is this writing down of it, and the Constitution, it sets out the general principles. By which we govern ourselves. Again, those general principles that Hayek talked about in the very introduction, right? At the very beginning of the book, he says that we need to think through what the general principles are by which we're going to govern ourselves. And he says we need to restate these for future generations because they don't, they won't know it automatically. And then he says that in Chapter 8, when he's talking about democracy, he says democracy's got to be limited by these general principles. And so how does that happen? The Constitution ends up serving as this higher order of law, right? That ordinary law has to comply. So that if you wanted to have, let's say when we were talking about Chapter 8, when we were talking about democracy, we said that if the temporary majority wanted to write some law about the establishment of religion, it can't do that because you have in the First Amendment says Congress shall enact no law regarding the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So we have something written down that says you can't do that. Ordinary law has to comply with what your Constitution says. So the Constitution acts as the higher order of law, and it sets out those general principles by which we're going to govern ourselves. So again, you'll notice that on the second exam, I'll often ask, what does Hyatt think is the purpose of the Constitution? And that's what we're talking about here. It's to serve as a higher order of law and to set out those general principles by which we're going to govern ourselves. So then he says that in a civilized society, power rests upon the understanding that it won't be arbitrary. Right? He says that in a civilized society, power rests on the understanding that it's not arbitrary. That is, if you think that it's going to be arbitrary, think about, would you grant somebody power? Would you just conceptually say, yeah, I'm going to give this person power if what they could do is they have the ability to chop my arms and legs off and throw me in a pile? Okay? Probably going to say, hey, I don't know that I want to do that, right? Whenever we say, oh yeah, we're going to let somebody have power over us, we're really doing with the understanding that there's got to be some limit on what they can do. That's what Hayek's point here is. He says that power rests on the understanding that it's not arbitrary. In fact, he says that power is not a physical fact, but a state of opinion which people obey. Right? That is, you remember that. So in chapter 12, he says it's a state of opinion. Which people obey. Remember that earlier on, he said that a society, society becomes civilized, what? Not by granting themselves laws, but by obeying agreeing to a common code of conduct, right? That's when we were talking about urinating in the pool, right? So that he's saying something, similar here. That is, what's power about? Power is where you guys pretty much agree that this is what the government can do. This is what we're gonna, we're thinking about what the government can do. So if we were to look at if the government could, how is it that people stay in power? They stay in power pretty much because at least a large number of us think that they're doing okay, we're agreeing with what they're doing. There was a book that you might want to take a look at. It's a little book. It's called The Politics of Obedience. It's written by Edouard Bautier, and it was written in almost exactly the same time that Machiavelli wrote The Prince. And he's asking, well, how is it that this is during where you have the kings and it's during the feudal periods? And he's saying, well, how is it that these kings and the like stay in power when there's only one of them, right? There's only the one person. Why don't we just, why didn't they just get overthrown all the time? And his answer is that even though you have authority, you have to sort of do things which are still within the bounds of what the vast, or at least the large number of your constituency agrees with. That you can't just go off and do any old darn thing. So if you see somebody that's an authoritarian figure, it's probably they're staying in power. Probably if they're doing things which are within the boundaries of what at least a large number of the population agrees to be the case. You can't just be out there doing things which a large number of your folks don't agree with, because then you'll get overthrown. So he says that again. he says, in a civilized society, all power rests upon the understanding that power will be exercised according to some generally accepted principles. So what is the Constitution about? The Constitution, he says, is, again, the title of the book. It's the Constitution of Liberty. What is the purpose of the Constitution? We said that the purpose of the Constitution is to set out those general principles by which we're going to govern ourselves and to act as a higher order of law. So it's a form of boundary on what your government can do. So it is to limit this coercive power. Remember, we said that we've granted coercive power, monopoly of coercive power to the government. How do we make sure that that doesn't become Leviathan? The way you do that is to write down your Constitution, to write down in a founding document, here's how we're going to here's how we're going to limit what our government can do. But we didn't start out with the Constitution, right? The founders reacted to what was going on in Britain, but they started out with the Articles of Confederation. Right? You didn't have you didn't have a government of the United States. Okay, you had state governments, and they wrote an article that said we are going to agree to do certain things, so that if Florida is attacked by the Spanish, we here in Massachusetts will send troops to go down and help out with that. Okay, well, part of the problem then became how do we ensure that that's going to happen? There's sort of two aspects to the Articles of Confederation that created a problem. The first one that Hayek talks about is that the states themselves could be coercive and were coercive. That is, note that it doesn't make sense for the legislature to amend the amend the Constitution. If you're going to actually serve as a limiting document. Because if you sort of think about it, what if the legislature could amend the Constitution? If the legislature could amend the Constitution, then how does it serve as a boundary on what the legislature can do, right? It's supposed to bind the temporary majority. So if the Congress ran up an impediment to what it wanted to do within the Constitution, the Congress would then just pass a law that changed the Constitution, then the temporary majority wasn't going to be bound. Notice that in your federal government, you can't do that, right? Under the federal government, you can only amend the Constitution by supermajority, 2/3 vote of the House to put a provision before the people, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So the Congress can't do that. Or you get an Article 5 amendment where the legislators, 2/3 of the states get together, they can call for a constitutional convention. Whatever they pass there has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So the Congress can't change the Constitution, nor can in your state government today, in Michigan, the legislature can't amend the Constitution. There are only some provisions on how you amend the Constitution within it's very, very similar. You can have the supermajority of the supermajority of the legislature could put something in front of the people, and then it has to be passed by a majority of the people. But anyway, you could have you could get signatures. If you get a sufficient number of signatures, then you can put the provision in front of the people, and there has to be an election. So the bottom line is that only the people can amend the Constitution through direct election within the state of Michigan. But what Hayek pointed out was that 6 states this could happen. In 6 of the states, that their constitution could be amended by the states themselves. And he also argues that there are a number of states where they just simply ignored what their state constitution did. So they had a problem in that the states themselves were coercive. And the second thing was, again, as we mentioned, how to defend the state. When you read the Federalist Papers, this is a big focus, right? In the Federalist Papers, one of the big focuses on how can I make it so that we can defend ourselves? And this is not just something that, is, well, maybe there's a low probability this will happen. Because by 1812, what's going on, right? We're fighting Great Britain in 1812. So it's not and we have the French and Indian Wars, right? So France and, Great Britain are clearly a threat to taking over the United States at the time. So how do we defend ourselves? If it's all just a confederation, then the problem is we don't have any national army, and we don't have any mechanism to raise the financing to fund that army. And so I'm just relying, if I'm Florida and Spain were to attack us, I'm just relying that the other states are going to agree to go out and help defend us. And they may decide that they don't want to do that. So what Hayek says is that Madison figures out a solution to these two problems. And Madison develops the idea of a federalist government. That is, you have state governments and you have a federal government, right? And state governments are standalone entities, right? The state of Michigan has powers, and we can talk about this in a moment, or the 10th Amendment talks about this, but, the state of Michigan has powers that the federal government can't intrude upon, so you have a federalist government says we're going to have a state government and we're going to have a federal government, and they're going to have separate powers, okay? And we're also going to have a division of power through the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. So the idea here is that what Hayek says is that coercive power of your government requires a concentration of power. It requires a concentration of power. And if we're going to limit our government so it isn't totally coercive, it doesn't become totally coercive, how can we do that? Well, we should divide the power up as much as possible. So what did the founders do? Well, Madison had read Montesquieu's Spirit of the Law. How many have ever heard of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws? Decent number. Okay. In Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, that's where he talks about dividing the executive power and judicial power and the legislative power up. Okay? So you don't have the king. Remember that Hayek talks about the rule of law and the rule of man. And he says the rule of man existed during the feudal period where the Lord could just wake up tomorrow and say, hey, this is the way it works, right? And the Lord has the executive power, has the legislative power, and the judicial power, okay? And what we do with the Constitution is we divide that up. And we noted earlier that your state of Michigan Constitution says that the legislative, that no branch of government can delegate its authority to some other branch. But that was happened when we were reading the chapter in Democracy where Hayek says that once the legislative branch grants executive power, once the legislative branch grants power to the executive branch to legislate, that it's not going to be able to get it back, right? He says if it gives wide coercive powers to the executive branch, it's not going to be able to get it back. So the idea here is that the division of power between the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judicial branch is to limit the amount of coercive action, right? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're giving coercive power over to our monopoly of coercive power over to our government. We want the government to minimize coercion, so we got to put some constraint on what your government can do. And that's what is going on with Madison's idea, that we're going to limit what the government can do. Notice that if you have a state government, that a state government has certain limits on its coercive power because you have freedom of movement. We noted that within, when Hayek was talking about the ancient Greeks, he said one of the freedoms of the ancient Greeks, a free person in ancient Greece, you have the right to movement. So if you have a state government, if a state government is coercive, then what can happen is you can simply move, right, to another state. That limits then what your powers of your state government are, right? If Illinois were to become a coercive state, had high taxes and lots of regulation and all sorts of stuff, then you could always move to Ohio or move to Michigan or move to Indiana. Okay? So that ability to move puts a constraint on what your states can do. So this limitation of power it's harder to do with the federal government from that perspective, that it's harder to move from your country to another country. We in the United States don't constrain you from moving somewhere else. If you want to leave the United States, God love you, just don't let the door hit you in the butt as you go, right? But other countries aren't like that. You have to, some countries don't allow you to exit. Now, when you leave the United States, the other countries don't have to take you. You might say, well, gee, I want to move to Mexico and become a citizen of Mexico. Well, Mexico doesn't have to give you citizenship, and so there's constraints on that fashion. So the ability to move from a federal government is harder than the ability to move from a state government, which sort of gives you the idea that maybe you want to put more limitations on your federal government than you do on your state government. So you're trying to limit what their amount of coercion that they're going to have. So Hayek's argument is that Madison was able to come up with this idea that limited what your state governments could do, and to solve the problem of the of defense, because now what we have is that we have a federal government, right? It can raise an army, and it can raise taxes to fund the army, right? Now, it can do other things, right? And we write down in, again, from the 10th Amendment, where the 10th Amendment says that your federal government only has certain enumerated powers, right? And all the powers not specifically granted by the Constitution to the federal government, nor prohibited by it to the states, are retained by the states or the people, respectively, right? But the fact that you've got a federal government makes it so that you can defend yourselves. And that, again, what the Federalist Papers, that was one of the foci of the, not focus this, but the focus, right? My wife used to teach 7th grade. My grammar gets corrected every now and then. But anyway, one of the foci is that the federal government has to be able to defend ourselves. That's why we're forming this government to start with. That's one of the things that keeps coming up in the Federalist Papers. So we have a government of the United States now. There is a central government, and its purpose is to defend ourselves. Notice that you might be more willing to join a government if it had a federalist system. That is, if you were Kurdish would you mind joining the government of Iraq if what happened was all the federal government of Iraq could do is defend the different provinces within Iraq, and Kurdistan would have most of the powers that couldn't be infringed upon by the federal government. You might be more likely to say, yeah, I'm willing to be a part of Iraq if you had a federalist system. So not a large number of places have a federalist system. Canada does, right? You have provinces in Canada, but you don't have a similar thing in China, etc. So that leads us towards, just to give an introduction here, towards what was going on in the Bill of Rights. That is, you have a Bill of Rights, and what it does is it sets out certain things that you have the right to do. You have the right to bear arms, for example, right? You have the right to peaceable assembly, etc. So the question is, why do you need a Bill of Rights? That is, if the federal government can only do the things that you've written down that it can do, then why do you need to tell me that it can't do something or that it must do something? That is, if I look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, right, where it says what Congress can do, it doesn't say anything about Congress being able to enact a law regarding the establishment of religion. Okay? So if I wrote in the Bill of Rights, suppose I write a Bill of Rights and says Congress shall enact no law regarding the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay? First Amendment. Now, why in the world did you write that down? Because it never said that it could. Okay? So if you write that out, then aren't you implying that it could have? And since it didn't say that it could have, aren't you implying that there are arbitrary powers that the federal government didn't have in the first place, right? So that's a conundrum with the Bill of Rights. And so next time what we'll do is we'll talk more about this conundrum between Hamilton and Jefferson about whether we ought to have a Bill of Rights. And so we ended up with one, as you may know. But we'll talk about how we ended up with one and the purpose of the 9th and 10th Amendment within that. So for Wednesday, we will finish chapter 12, and we may get started on the how the West grew rich. The exam is only going to cover through chapter 12 higher, right? So when we do the review session, we'll just focus on Hayek and Bastiat, right? But still, we'll probably do some of that. I don't know exactly where the review session will be. It'll be either in lane 124 or 125. I'll get that to you on.
You guys grabbing going?
I'm grabbing going.
What? No.
I want to get out of this and play around for a little while.
Alright, you guys look so professional for the donors.
That's our plan.
Saga, then knife for a minute, and then I'll stay with one.
Yeah.
You do what you gotta do then. Nelly says that to me. Words to live by. Yours is, your words to live by is, you know what I mean? And then Nelly says, do what you gotta do.
Do what you gotta do.
Okay. I've only been down there a couple times, but that's a nice area. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. I appreciate that. Yeah. The weather is a little bit
Sorry,
chilly.
I need to sneak in and take care of this.